You think you're clean. You probably showered this morning. You used soap, possibly several different specialized soaps for different body parts, because the modern personal care industry has convinced you that your face deserves a different soap from your body, and your hair deserves a different product entirely. And there is a specific product for every specific square centimeter of your skin that is prepared to make you slightly anxious about the state of whatever it is selling you the solution to. You brushed your teeth. You used deodorant. You are wearing clothing that has been washed with detergent in a machine that does the washing for you, dried in a tumble dryer or on a line, and stored in a wardrobe until needed. You have access to a toilet that whisks the evidence of your biological reality away through a pipe to somewhere you never have to think about. You live in a world where the baseline expectation of personal hygiene is so comprehensive and so thoroughly maintained by the infrastructure around you that you have largely stopped noticing that the infrastructure exists. Now, remove all of it. Remove the shower, the soap, the shampoo, the deodorant, the washing machine, the tumble dryer, the wardrobe. Remove the toilet and the pipe and the sewage system. Remove the running water entirely. Put yourself in northern France or England in the year 1300, in a timber-framed house with a beaten earth floor and a central fire that produces more smoke than heat and no chimney, and ask yourself, how clean are you now? The honest answer is considerably less clean than you were a moment ago. And the medieval person who has been living in this house their entire life is, by the standards of your recently departed morning routine, not clean in any way that the modern personal care industry would recognize. But here's the thing, and this is the thing that the popular narrative about medieval hygiene consistently gets wrong. The medieval person was not simply a dirty person who hadn't thought about cleanliness. They were a person operating in a specific material context with specific available resources, who had specific ideas about what cleanliness meant and why it mattered, and who was managing their personal hygiene with the specific combination of genuine effort and genuine limitation that the medieval world provided. Some of what they did is genuinely, comprehensively revolting by modern standards. We're going to cover all of it. The teeth, the toilets, the bathing, the laundry, the skin, the hair, the specific biological processes that the medieval world managed in ways that will make you grateful for every aspect of the modern sanitation infrastructure. But some of what they did is more interesting and more sophisticated than the simple "everyone was filthy all the time" narrative allows. And understanding the difference, understanding what was genuinely horrible and why, and what was reasonable within the constraints of the medieval material world, is the specific, interesting work of the history of hygiene. Let's get into it, possibly while breathing through your mouth. Chapter 1. The smell. Establishing the olfactory baseline of the medieval world. Before we discuss specific hygiene habits, we need to establish the smell. Not because the smell is the most important thing about medieval hygiene. It isn't. But because the smell is the immediate, visceral thing that the modern person, transported to the medieval world, would notice before anything else. The smell would hit you before the sight, before the sound, before any of the specific individual hygiene habits that this script is going to examine. It would hit you like a physical force, and it would take some time to process what exactly it was and where it was coming from. The short answer is everything. The smell was coming from everything. The streets of the medieval town were not paved in the modern sense. They were unpaved dirt and gravel. And the animals that used them, the horses, the cattle being driven to market, the pigs that many urban households kept and that wandered relatively freely, contributed to the street's surface in the continuous industrious way of animals that have no alternative. The medieval town was a town in which the smell of animal waste was the ambient background, present in every street, concentrated at the market where the animals were brought for sale, absolutely overwhelming at the shambles, the butchery district, where the slaughtering happened and the waste from the slaughtering accumulated. The shambles. The word survives in the modern language as a scene of total disorder. And the reason for this linguistic inheritance is the specific experience of the medieval shambles, the district where the butchers practiced their trade, and where the blood and the entrails and the offal and the bones accumulated in the streets, in ways that the town's waste management system, which was minimal, could not adequately address. The smell of the medieval shambles was not a smell that the modern person can easily imagine, because the modern person has no experience of the large-scale outdoor continuous processing of animal carcasses in an environment without refrigeration, without modern waste disposal, and without the specific olfactory desensitization that the medieval butcher had developed over a lifetime of professional exposure. The river through the medieval town was the town's primary water source and its primary waste disposal system simultaneously. The citizens drew their drinking water from the river. The tanneries dumped the chemicals from the leather processing, the urine, the animal brains, the various materials that the tanning process required, into the river. The fulling mills that processed wool dumped the fulling residues into the river. The households dumped their waste into the river. The river received all of this with the specific democratic acceptance of a body of water that has no choice in the matter. And the resulting mixture was the specific river that everyone downstream was drinking from. The London Bridge area in the medieval period, the specific concentrated district where the tanneries and the shambles and the various other malodorous industries of the medieval city clustered, was described by contemporary accounts with a directness that modern historical prose finds difficult to match for pure olfactory impact. The 13th century observer who described the London waterfront did not use euphemism. They described what they smelled. The personal smell of the medieval person was the smell of a person who bathed less frequently than the modern standard requires, wore clothing that was washed less frequently than the modern standard requires, and lived and worked in an environment that produced smells that the clothing absorbed and retained. The medieval person's relationship with their own smell was not the relationship of someone who found the smell alarming. It was the relationship of someone for whom this was the baseline, the normal, the expected olfactory experience of a human body going about its business. This is important to understand before proceeding, because the modern tendency to characterize the medieval person as disgusting because they smell different from the modern standard is the tendency of someone applying a standard that is specific to the modern world's specific material advantages to a world that didn't have those advantages. The medieval person wasn't disgusting. They smelled. These are not the same thing, and conflating them produces the kind of condescending historical narrative that this script is trying to avoid, even as it describes the genuine, specific, sometimes extraordinary things that the medieval world did in the name of personal hygiene. That said, some of it is genuinely extraordinary. Let's start with the teeth. Chapter 2. The teeth. Medieval dental hygiene, and why your dentist would weep. The medieval mouth was not the modern mouth. This is not just a matter of cosmetics, not just the specific alignment and whiteness that the modern orthodontist and dental hygienist have made standard. It is a matter of the fundamental biological condition of the teeth, the enamel, the gums, the bone beneath, and the specific combination of diet, dental care, and the specific oral bacteria that the medieval oral environment produced. There was no fluoride in the medieval water supply. Fluoride, the specific mineral that modern water fluoridation and modern fluoride toothpaste provides, and that dramatically reduces the rate of dental caries by strengthening the tooth enamel, was not a component of the medieval dental care regime, because the concept of fluoride and its relationship to dental health was a 20th century discovery. The medieval tooth was developing and maintaining its enamel without the specific protective mineral that modern dental public health has made standard. There was no proper toothbrush, not in the sense of the nylon-bristled plastic instrument with the angled head and the soft or medium or firm bristle option that the modern consumer chooses from the pharmacy shelf. The medieval tooth cleaning implement was various and inventive, and in comparison to the modern toothbrush, relatively ineffective. The twig brush, a twig from certain trees, particularly hazel, whose end was frayed by chewing into a brush-like tool, was one of the standard tooth cleaning implements of the medieval period, documented in the household management literature and in the medical texts. The frayed twig was applied to the teeth in the specific rubbing motion that the household advice recommended, the wood fibers serving as the bristles and the sap of certain trees, providing some antimicrobial benefit. The hazel twig had genuine antimicrobial properties that the modern scientific analysis confirms. The twig brush was not entirely without effect. Rubbing the teeth with a cloth, a piece of linen wrapped around the finger and rubbed across the surface of the teeth, was the other standard approach, and it was not entirely without merit either. The mechanical removal of the soft plaque from the tooth surface by the cloth's rubbing was achieving something, even if it was achieving it less effectively and less thoroughly than the modern toothbrush's bristle action. The tooth powders and tooth cleaning preparations that the medieval period produced were a mixture of the genuinely useful and the actively harmful. Ground charcoal, one of the most common tooth powder ingredients of the medieval and early modern period, has genuine abrasive and antimicrobial properties. The charcoal tooth powder removed staining and surface deposits from the tooth and killed some of the bacteria responsible for tooth decay and gum disease. It was black, which made the teeth temporarily black after application, but the rinsing removed most of it. Ground salt, another common tooth powder ingredient, is antimicrobial and mildly abrasive, and the salt-based tooth powder or tooth rub was achieving a genuine cleaning effect. The salt and charcoal combination that appears in numerous medieval household management texts was, by the standards of what was available, a reasonable dental hygiene preparation. The actively harmful preparations were the ones that included highly abrasive materials, ground pumice stone, ground brick, that cleaned the tooth surface effectively, but did so at the cost of removing the enamel that was doing the protecting. The medieval tooth, cleaned with pumice, was a tooth being polished into sensitivity and eventual structural failure by the specific abrasiveness of the cleaning agent. The medieval diet was the most important factor in the medieval tooth's specific fate, and here the news is surprisingly mixed. The diet of the medieval poor, the grain-heavy, sugar-poor diet of the peasant household, was significantly less carcinogenic than the modern diet. Sugar was expensive and imported, available to the wealthy and genuinely uncommon in the ordinary medieval diet. Without the refined sugar that is the primary driver of dental caries in the modern diet, the teeth of the medieval poor were frequently less cavity-ridden than you might expect. The teeth of the wealthy were a different story. The wealthy medieval person had access to sugar, in the form of imported cane sugar and the various preserved fruit and confected sugar preparations that the upper-class medieval kitchen produced in quantity. And the teeth of the wealthy medieval person show the specific caries pattern of the sugar consumer. The medieval lord who could afford sugar and who consumed it in the quantities that the feast day preparations involved was a medieval lord whose teeth were deteriorating from dental caries in the specific pattern that the modern dentist recognizes as the signature of the high-sugar diet. The dental treatment available was limited. The primary dental treatment of the medieval period was extraction. When a tooth hurt badly enough, it came out. The extraction was performed with the specific tools that the medieval practitioner had available: the dental key, the pelican, the forceps, instruments whose design was oriented toward the application of sufficient force to remove the tooth from the socket in which the periodontal ligament had embedded it. The anesthesia available was the anesthesia of the medieval period, which is to say not much. Wine, in large quantities, could dull the edge of the pain without eliminating it. Various herbal preparations, the juice of the henbane plant, the oil of cloves, the various preparations of the medieval pharmacopoeia, could reduce sensitivity and provide some local analgesic effect. The specific effectiveness of these preparations varied, and the patient's experience of having a tooth removed with the medieval dental instruments and the medieval anesthesia was not an experience that the patient remembered with fondness. The dental abscess, the infected tooth whose root canal had allowed the bacteria of the oral environment to penetrate to the dental pulp and from there to the bone, was the medieval dental emergency, and it was an emergency that could become a medical emergency with speed. The dental abscess that spread from the tooth to the jaw, from the jaw to the neck, from the neck to the airway. The specific anatomical progression that the dental infection can make when untreated was a potential cause of death in the medieval period, and the dental records preserved in skeletal remains confirm that dental abscesses were a common finding in medieval populations. The gum disease, the periodontal disease that the bacterial plaque accumulating at the gum margin produces, was essentially universal in the medieval adult population, and the medieval records of gum treatments reveal both the awareness of the condition and the specific ineffectiveness of the available treatments. The recipes for gum treatments in the medieval household management literature, the herb infusions, the salt preparations, the various mouthwash-like preparations, were addressing the symptom of the gum disease without being able to address the bacterial biofilm that was causing it, because the bacterial cause of periodontal disease was unknown. The mouthwash tradition of the medieval period is one of the more interesting aspects of medieval oral hygiene, because it reflects the genuine understanding that the mouth's condition affected the breath, and the breath affected the social interaction, and the social interaction mattered. The preparations recommended for the improvement of the breath, the aromatic herbs, the spices, the wine rinses, were addressing the specifically social consequence of the oral condition that the medieval social world found problematic. The bad breath, the halitosis of the medieval population, whose combination of dental decay, gum disease, and the specific diet of the period produced breath that the contemporary medical literature addresses with the specificity of a problem taken seriously, was managed through the specific cultural technology of the aromatic herb, the carrying of a sprig of parsley, the chewing of a cardamom pod, the consumption of the specific herbs that the medieval tradition associated with breath freshening. These were the personal hygiene technologies of the medieval mouth, managing the social consequence of the oral condition that the medical technology could not adequately treat. The medieval dental record, the skeletal remains that the archaeologists examine, the written records of the dental treatments recorded in the medical literature, the specific observations of the medieval physicians about their patients' oral conditions, is a record of a population living with the specific dental situation that the diet, the available dental care, and the absence of fluoride produced. Significant dental wear from the abrasive diet, variable rates of dental caries depending on the access to sugar, near universal gum disease, and the chronic discomfort of the untreated or inadequately treated dental condition that was simply part of the experience of being an adult in the medieval world. Your dentist would weep. But the medieval person had never met a dentist, had never experienced the specific relief of the modern dental crown, or the root canal treatment, or the prescription antibiotics that resolve the dental abscess before it becomes life-threatening, and was managing their oral condition with the specific stoicism of people for whom this level of oral discomfort was simply the normal experience of having teeth in a world that didn't yet know how to take adequate care of them. Chapter 3. The bathing. How often medieval people actually bathed, and what happened when they did medieval people bathed. This needs to be stated clearly and directly, because the popular narrative, the narrative of the unwashed, permanently filthy medieval person who went their entire life without intentionally getting wet, is one of the more comprehensively wrong pieces of popular history currently in circulation, and its wrongness has become so embedded in the popular imagination that stating its opposite feels counterintuitive. Medieval people bathed, not as often as the modern standard requires, not with the facilities that modern bathing involves, not with the soap formulations and the heated water systems and the individual privacy that the modern bathroom provides. But they bathed. They thought bathing was important. They wrote about bathing in their household management literature and their medical texts and their etiquette manuals, and the evidence from the archaeological, documentary, and artistic record confirms that regular bathing was an expected part of the medieval person's life, not an exceptional event. How often is the question that matters, and the answer varies by social class, by the available facilities, and by the specific period and region of the medieval world. The general picture that the historical evidence supports is approximately once a week for the majority of the population. Less frequent than the modern daily or every other day standard, but considerably more frequent than the never that the popular myth implies. The bath of the medieval household was not the porcelain tub with the chrome fittings and the hot and cold taps that the modern bathroom contains. It was a wooden tub, a barrel essentially, cut to the appropriate dimensions, filled with water that had been heated over the fire in a kettle or a pot, and poured into the tub, in the quantities that the heating capacity of the fire and the patience of the household member doing the heating allowed. The heating of the bathwater was the specific limitation that made medieval bathing less frequent than modern bathing. Not the lack of interest, not the cultural acceptance of permanent dirtiness, but the specific labor requirement of heating the water that the bath required. Heating enough water to fill a wooden tub to a comfortable bathing depth took significant time and effort, and the specific calculation of whether the time and effort were warranted was made differently by different households in different circumstances. The wealthy household had servants to heat the water and fill the tub, which made the calculation easier. The labor cost was someone else's labor, and the wealthy medieval person could bathe as often as they chose without the direct personal investment of the labor. The accounts of the great medieval households document regular bathing for the lord and the lady, the preparation of the bath as a standard household service, the specific preparations, the aromatic herbs in the bathwater, the warm towels, the specific post-bath preparations that made the aristocratic bath a comfort measure as well as a hygiene measure. The public bathhouse was the bathing option for the medieval urban population that didn't have the household facilities for private bathing. The stews, the public bathhouses of the medieval town, were common urban institutions, documented in London, Paris, and the major cities of continental Europe from at least the 12th century onward. The stews charged a fee for the use of the bathing facilities, provided the heated water, sometimes provided the attendants who performed the bathing service, and served as the social spaces of the urban working population, whose domestic arrangements didn't include a private tub. The London stews were concentrated in Southwark, the area on the south bank of the Thames that was the specific location of the activities that the City of London authorities preferred to keep at arm's length. And they were a notable and somewhat notorious feature of the medieval urban landscape. The notoriety arose from the specific additional services that some of the London stews provided, alongside the bathing, the combination of the bathhouse with prostitution that the medieval record documents, and that the city authorities periodically attempted to regulate or suppress. The combination of the bathhouse with commercial sex was not universal. Many medieval bathhouses were straightforward hygiene facilities without the additional element. But it was common enough to give the stews their specific reputation and to complicate the modern reconstruction of the medieval bathing culture. The legitimate bathing function and the associated commercial sex function coexisted in the same institution, and the medieval commentary on the stews reflects the specific discomfort of the moralists with this combination. The medical literature of the medieval period was enthusiastically positive about bathing. The regimen Sanitatis Salernitanum, the medieval health guide produced at the medical school at Salerno, one of the most influential medical texts of the medieval period, recommended bathing for health as well as for cleanliness. The specific humoral logic of the recommendation was that bathing opened the pores, expelled the waste products that the body accumulated, and restored the humoral balance that the body's normal functioning required. The specific mechanism was wrong. The humoral theory is not an accurate description of the body's functioning, but the recommendation was correct in its practical outcome. Regular bathing contributed to good health. The bathing in summer and the bathing in winter were different experiences in the medieval period, and the medical literature addressed this difference with the specific concern about the effects of cold water on the humoral balance that the medieval medical theory generated. Bathing in cold water, the winter bath, or the bath in a heated room that had cooled before the bather got in, was considered medically risky by the medieval physicians, who believed that the cold water's effect on the open pores was to admit the cold and moist humors that produced respiratory illness and other cold-related conditions. The specific recommendation was for warm baths, water heated to a temperature that the medical tradition considered beneficial for opening the pores and expelling the waste products without exposing the bather to the risk of the cold. The warm bath was the medically endorsed bath, and the medieval bathing culture's emphasis on warm water was the specific intersection of comfort preference and medical recommendation that both pointed in the same direction. The soap was available, and it was used, and it was made from the specific combination of fat, animal fat or olive oil, and alkali, the ash of certain plants, from which the potassium carbonate or sodium carbonate that the saponification process required could be extracted. That soap making has used since its development in the ancient Near East. The medieval soap was coarser and less refined than the modern product, and the specific qualities that the modern consumer expects, the lather, the fragrance, the specific skin feel, were less developed than the modern version. But it was soap, it performed the basic function of soap, and it was used in the bathing that the medieval household conducted. The hair washing was part of the bathing, and the medieval approach to hair washing reflects the specific intersection of hygiene concern, medical advice, and practical limitation that characterizes the medieval approach to personal care generally. The medical advice about hair washing in the medieval period was more cautious than the modern practice. The specific concern about the cold water reaching the head and producing the headaches and respiratory conditions that the humoral theory associated with cold exposure to the head produced recommendations for careful, warm, protected hair washing that sound somewhat elaborate by modern standards. The specific preparations used in medieval hair washing were the preparations that the medieval household had available. The eggs and the vinegar and the herb infusions that the household management literature recommended as hair treatments, performing the functions of the modern shampoo and conditioner with the specific effectiveness that the available materials permitted. The egg yolk, as a conditioning treatment for hair, is a medieval recommendation whose effectiveness the modern understanding of the egg's protein and fat content supports. The medieval hair treatment that the modern beauty DIY enthusiast rediscovers periodically and presents as a new discovery. So why does the popular narrative say medieval people never bathed? The specific origin of the myth is worth tracing because it is a myth with a specific source rather than a general misconception. The myth appears to derive partly from the specific statements of some medieval church authorities who were suspicious of bathing on the grounds that the mixed-sex public bathhouses were sites of immorality, that excessive attention to the body was a form of vanity that distracted from spiritual concerns, and that the mortification of the flesh, the deliberate acceptance of physical discomfort as a spiritual discipline, was a virtue that the comfort of the warm bath undermined. Some of the more ascetically inclined saints and church figures did practice deliberate avoidance of bathing as a form of spiritual discipline, the rejection of bodily comfort as a demonstration of the priority of spiritual over physical concerns. These specific individuals, the Desert Fathers, the ascetic saints, whose hagiographies describe their deliberate physical austerity, are the specific source of the medieval people never bathed narrative, because the hagiographies that recorded their practice were widely read and widely influential, and the specific accounts of saints who hadn't washed for years were taken as representative of medieval practice rather than as the specific, deliberate, exceptional practice of people pursuing ascetic holiness. The saint who hadn't bathed was a saint demonstrating their contempt for bodily comfort. The medieval merchant in the bathhouse next door was demonstrating nothing of the kind. Chapter 4. The toilet, the specific realities of medieval waste management. You need to go to the toilet. In the modern world, this is a statement with an obvious, immediate, completely private resolution. You walk to the bathroom. You close the door. The toilet is there, clean, white, equipped, with the specific plumbing that connects it to the sewage system that carries whatever you deposit in it through pipes beneath the streets to a treatment facility somewhere you never need to think about. The entire operation takes perhaps 2 minutes, involves no other people, produces no lasting environmental consequence in your immediate vicinity, and leaves no trace in your daily life, except the paper record on the plumbing bill. In the medieval world, this is a statement with a considerably more complicated set of possible resolutions, each of which involves some combination of the outdoors, other people, and a lasting environmental consequence in your immediate vicinity that the medieval sanitation infrastructure was inadequately equipped to address. Let's go through the options from most to least comfortable, because the range is genuinely instructive about the relationship between social class and bodily function in the medieval world. The garderobe was the toilet option of the castle and the large manor house. The specific architectural feature of the medieval stone building that provided the closest thing to the modern private toilet that the period produced. The garderobe was a small room or alcove projecting from the castle wall, containing a stone seat with a hole through which the waste fell, either into a cesspit below or directly into the moat or the ditch outside the wall, depending on the specific architectural arrangement of the particular castle. The word garde-robe means in medieval French, guard the robe, and the specific etymology tells you something interesting about the garderobe's secondary function. The projection of the garderobe from the outer wall created a shaft through which the waste fell, and the ammonia fumes rising through that shaft from the accumulated waste below were the specific fumigant that the medieval household used to deter moths from the stored clothing that was sometimes kept in or near the garderobe. The medieval toilet was also the moth-proofing system, which is the kind of medieval multi-purpose efficiency that you can only admire in a slightly horrified way. The garderobe's stone seat was cold. It was cold in summer, when the stone maintained the thermal properties of the stone, and it was significantly colder in winter, when the cold air flowing up the shaft from below contributed to the experience. The garderobe was not a space designed for extended contemplation. It was designed for the specific rapid transaction of the bodily function, and the temperature of the stone seat was an effective incentive toward that rapid transaction. The cesspit was the waste storage system of the urban medieval household that couldn't rely on a moat or a river to carry the waste away. The cesspit was dug beneath the house or in the garden, and the waste from the house's toilet facilities accumulated in it until it was full, at which point the gong firmer, the specific professional who emptied cesspits, was employed to remove the accumulated waste. The gong firmer was a real job, a real medieval profession, documented in the municipal records of medieval towns, employing real people who were paid real money for the specific, necessary, extremely unpleasant work of emptying the cesspits of the urban population. The gong firmers worked at night, the night soil workers, as the early modern period would call their successors, removing the contents of the cesspit by hand and bucket, and carrying the material away to the fields outside the town where it was used as fertilizer. The specific pay of the gong firmer was the pay of essential, highly undesirable labor, significantly higher than the ordinary laborer's wage, reflecting the specific supply and demand of a service that was genuinely necessary and genuinely unwanted as a profession. The gong firmers of the medieval town were the sanitation workers on whom the health of the urban population depended, and the records that document their work are among the more illuminating documents in the social history of the medieval city. The cesspit accident was a real and documented medieval hazard. The medieval record contains multiple accounts of people falling into cesspits. The structural failure of the wooden cover, or the stone surround of the cesspit, the person who stepped on the cover in the dark and found it less structurally sound than they had assumed. The specific terrible experience of falling into the accumulated waste of a cesspit that might be several meters deep. The death of Richard de Pudlicot in 1296, or rather the near death, as he apparently survived the fall, is one of the more dramatically documented cesspit accidents of the medieval record. The cesspit overflow was the municipal sanitation crisis that the medieval town experienced with depressing regularity. The cesspit that was not emptied frequently enough, because the gong firmers were expensive, because the household was putting off the expense, because the rate of accumulation had been underestimated, eventually overflowed, and the overflow entered the street, and the street was where people walked, and where the rain carried the contents toward the river, and the river was where people got their drinking water. The specific connection between the cesspit and the drinking water, the specific pathway by which the waterborne pathogens of the cesspit contents made their way into the water that the population drank, was the public health mechanism that the medieval town didn't understand, but whose consequences it experienced in the specific pattern of waterborne disease outbreaks that the historical record documents. The cholera, the typhoid, the various intestinal diseases of the medieval period followed the specific geography of the contaminated water supply, concentrated in the areas where the cesspit density was highest, and the water source was closest, spreading in the patterns that the contamination of the water sources produced. The municipal regulations about cesspit management, the London ordinances about the distance that cesspits were required to be from the neighbor's property, the regulations about the disposal of cesspit contents, the requirements about the frequency of emptying, are among the medieval municipal records that illuminate the specific public health management that the medieval city was attempting in the face of the sanitation challenge that its own density had created. The regulations were imperfectly enforced. The violations were common. The consequences were predictable. The open drain, the kennel, the central channel in the medieval street designed to carry the wastewater and the refuse toward the river, was the municipal waste management infrastructure of the medieval town at its most basic. The kennel was the street's drain, running down the center or the side of the road, receiving the wastewater from the houses on either side, the horse droppings and other animal waste from the street traffic, the refuse that the householders threw from the upper windows. Throwing waste from the upper windows into the street was standard practice, and the specific warning, garde l'eau, the anglicization of the French gardes l'eau, watch out for the water, was the specific auditory warning that the person about to empty the chamber pot from the upper window gave to the pedestrians below. The pedestrians who heard the warning had a moment to step aside. The pedestrians who didn't hear it, or who heard it too late, got the contents of the chamber pot on them. The chamber pot itself was the indoor toilet solution for the nighttime and the cold weather when the outdoor facilities were either inconvenient or actually inaccessible. The chamber pot, the ceramic or metal vessel kept in the bedchamber for overnight use, was the specific technology of the pre-plumbing bedroom, and its use and disposal were part of the daily domestic routine that the servants managed in the larger household, and that the household members managed themselves in the more modest arrangement. The emptying of the chamber pot was the morning task that preceded all the other morning tasks, and the specific responsibility of this emptying in the household hierarchy reflects the social geography of medieval domestic service. The chamber pot was emptied by whoever was lowest in the household's service hierarchy and most directly responsible for the bedchamber's maintenance. The lady's maid, the personal servant, the domestic who was assigned the chamber's management and whose duties included the specific, less glorious aspects of that management. The rural situation was different from the urban one, in ways that were not entirely better. The rural household's toilet facilities were typically simpler than the castle's garderobe and didn't involve the urban cesspit. The rural household used the fields, the hedgerows, the specific areas behind the barn, or the outbuildings that the household had designated for the purpose, and the natural processes of decomposition in the soil managed the waste without the concentrated infrastructure that the urban density required. The specific medieval practice of going to the garden, the specific euphemism documented in the household management literature for the toilet visit, reflects the rural practice of the outdoor facility that the garden or the field provided, and the literal and the euphemistic meanings of the phrase were closely related in the medieval context. The garden as a space that included the toilet function alongside the horticultural function was the normal rural arrangement. The communal privy, the shared outdoor toilet facility that the medieval village or the urban tenement building maintained for the use of multiple households, was the intermediate solution between the private garderobe of the wealthy and the complete absence of facilities of the poorest. The communal privy was a structure over a pit, sometimes with a basic roof and walls, sometimes without, shared by the households who used it and maintained by no one in particular, which meant it was maintained to the level that the collective commitment of its users produced, which was, in many cases, not a high level. The specific record of the communal privy in the medieval municipal accounts, the occasional repair, the periodic emptying, the regulations about its use, is the record of the specific sanitation infrastructure that the medieval town could manage at the level of the ordinary population. And it was infrastructure whose condition the modern sanitation engineer would find alarming, and whose function the modern public health officer would find inadequate. The river was the toilet for the medieval town in the most direct possible sense, not just through the indirect pathway of the cesspit overflow and the kennel drainage, but directly in the specific practice of using the bridge or the riverbank or the boat as the toilet facility and depositing the waste directly into the waterway. The medieval London Bridge was documented as a location used for this purpose, and the specific downstream consequences for the water quality of the Thames are consequences that any understanding of basic water chemistry would have predicted. The Thames in the medieval period was not the relatively clean, regulated waterway of the modern world. It was the sewage system, the water supply, the commercial highway, and the toilet of a city of 50,000 to 100,000 people, and the specific combination of functions produced a river whose condition the modern environmental regulator would treat as a major environmental emergency. The salmon that swam in the Thames in the medieval period, the salmon that the medieval London Bridge records document as abundant, disappeared from the Thames by the 18th and 19th centuries as the city grew and the sewage load exceeded the river's capacity for biological recovery. The salmon only returned to the Thames in the late 20th century after the construction of the modern sewage infrastructure that finally separated the water supply from the waste disposal. The specific smell of the medieval town's toilet situation was the smell of the cesspit and the kennel and the river and the chamber pot, combined with the smell of the animal waste from the streets and the smell of the slaughterhouses and the tanneries and all the other malodorous industries of the medieval urban economy. The smell was the ambient condition of the medieval town, and the medieval person who lived in it had the specific olfactory adaptation of long exposure, the accommodation to the baseline that the chronically exposed nose performs, reducing the conscious perception of the constant smell to the background level where it stops registering as a distinct sensory input and becomes simply the smell of home. Chapter 5. The laundry. What medieval people did to their clothes, and why it was harder than you think the laundry was women's work. This is a statement about the medieval gender division of labor, not a value judgment, and it is a statement that the historical record supports with considerable consistency. The washing of clothing was, across the medieval period, and across the range of social settings where it was performed, primarily the responsibility and the physical labor of women, the laundress, the washerwoman, the female domestic servant, whose duties included the laundry, the housewife, whose weekly routine included the washing that the household's clothing required. The specific physical labor of medieval laundry was genuinely heavy work, harder than the modern person's experience of doing laundry, which involves loading a machine, pressing a button, transferring the contents to another machine, pressing another button, and possibly folding. The medieval laundry involved the physical beating and wringing of wet fabric, the hauling of water, the management of the wood fire that heated the water, the outdoor exposure in whatever weather the washing day produced, and the specific sustained physical effort of doing all of this by hand, with no mechanical assistance. The laundry of the medieval household began with the water. The water needed for washing came from the same sources as the water for drinking and cooking, the well, the river, the conduit, and it needed to be carried to the washing location in the buckets and pots that the household had available. The specific labor of carrying the water, which for a large household wash might amount to many bucket loads, was the first stage of the laundry, and it was done before the heating of the water and before the washing itself. The water was heated in the large cauldron that the washing required, the lye pot, the vessel in which the washing water was combined with the lye that served as the medieval detergent. Lye, the strongly alkaline solution produced by leaching water through wood ash, was the primary cleaning agent of the medieval laundry, the substance that broke down the fats and proteins of the staining and the bodily soiling that the clothing accumulated in use. The lye was made from the ash of the household fire, a genuinely recycled resource, the waste product of the heating system, serving as the cleaning agent of the laundry system. The lye solution was effective. It is, in chemical terms, a genuine detergent, performing the same basic function as the modern detergent through the alkaline saponification of the fats in the soiling. It was also strongly alkaline, harsh on the fabric, and harsh on the skin of the person doing the washing. The laundress's hands, after a day of working with lye, were hands that had been in contact with a strongly alkaline solution for hours, and the specific condition of the medieval laundress's hands, chapped, cracked, red, sore, is the specific occupational hazard of the work that the historical accounts of the laundry trade document. The soap was used in the laundry alongside the lye, or sometimes, instead of it, in the households that could afford the soap and preferred its milder action on the fabric. The medieval soap's cleaning action was the same action as the modern laundry detergent in its basic principle, and the household that used soap in the laundry was doing something that produced a genuinely clean result. The soap was less harsh on the fabric than the straight lye solution, and the textile management literature of the period recommended soap for the finer fabrics, whose durability in strong lye would have been compromised. The washing technique was the beating technique, the physical beating of the wet, soaped or lyed fabric against a flat stone or a wooden surface which broke up the soiling and worked the cleaning solution through the fabric fibers. The beetle, the wooden paddle used for beating the laundry, is documented in the medieval household management literature and in the visual record of illuminated manuscripts that show the laundry process. The rhythmic beating of the wet fabric was the specific physical action of the medieval laundress, and it was the specific action whose physical demands made the laundry a genuinely exhausting day's work. The rinsing of the laundry required the same water-hauling effort as the washing. Clean water to rinse the cleaning solution out of the fabric, the rinsing repeated until the water ran clear, the fabric wrung by hand to remove as much water as possible before the drying. The wringing of heavy wet wool or linen was the specific physical challenge of the wringing stage. The fabric was twisted and squeezed by hand, or between two people, each twisting in the opposite direction, to remove the water that the dry weight of the fabric would multiply to a genuinely heavy burden. The drying of the medieval laundry was the outdoor drying that the available technology provided. The hedges, the lines, the flat surfaces of the grass where the fabric was laid out in the sun, and the wind that the medieval washing days' good weather permitted. The specific weather dependency of the outdoor drying was the specific scheduling challenge of the medieval laundry. The washing day needed to be a day when the weather permitted the drying, and in the northern European climate, the days that combined adequate temperature, adequate wind, and absence of rain for the several hours that the drying of heavy fabrics required were not infinitely available. The winter laundry was the specific challenge, the wet fabric that wouldn't dry in the cold and the damp, the washing that had to be dried indoors near the fire in the specific conditions that the fire's warmth and the interior's limited space provided, the clothing that was partially dried by the fire, but retained a residual damp that made it uncomfortable to wear, and susceptible to the mold that the residual moisture encouraged in the storage. How often was the laundry done? The answer is, less often than the modern standard requires, and with specific strategies for managing the interval between washings that the medieval household developed from necessity. The outer garments, the tunic, the gown, the surcoat, the cloak, were washed infrequently. The washing of wool in particular was a process that damaged the fabric, the shrinkage, the felting, the dimensional changes that the combination of hot water and mechanical action produced in wool meant that washing the outer wool garments was a process undertaken with care and not more frequently than necessary. The specific textile management strategy of the medieval household was to wash the outer garments rarely and to manage the interval between washings through the practices that reduced the accumulation of soiling, the brushing, the airing, the beating to remove surface dust, and to restore the fabric's appearance. The linen undergarment was washed more frequently than the outer garment. The linen chemise, the linen shirt, the linen undergarment that was the layer between the body and the outer wool, was the specific textile whose frequent washing was both more possible and more important. The linen was the layer that absorbed the sweat and the bodily oils and the various biological materials that the body produced. And the linen's absorptive function was the specific argument for washing it more frequently than the outer garments. The medieval understanding of the linen undergarment's hygiene function was sophisticated in the specific way of an understanding that had arrived at the right practical conclusion through the wrong theoretical framework. The medieval medical tradition's view was that the linen absorbed the waste products that the body expelled through the skin, the corrupt humors, the excess moisture, the various materials that the body's normal functioning produced, and that washing the linen regularly removed these waste products and maintained the body's health. The mechanism was wrong. The humoral theory of bodily waste is not an accurate description of how the body manages its metabolic waste, but the conclusion was correct. The frequent washing of the linen undergarment that was in direct contact with the body was the specific hygienic practice that made the most difference to the personal cleanliness of the person wearing it. The clean linen was a genuinely important hygiene measure, and the medieval household that maintained its linen in clean condition was doing something that genuinely mattered for the personal hygiene of its members. The professional laundress was the urban service provider whose business was the management of the laundry for the households that chose to outsource this particular domestic task. The laundresses of the medieval town, documented in the municipal records, in the guild records, in the occasional court records that illuminate the commercial disputes of the trade, were running a genuine service industry, collecting the laundry of their customers, washing it in the communal washing places, by the river or in their own facilities, returning it clean and dried. The communal washing place, the lavoir, the washing stone by the river, the specific location that the town designated for the laundry work, was the outdoor laundry facility of the medieval urban community, the equivalent of the modern laundromat in its social function as a gathering place for the women who did the laundry and a working place for the professional laundress. The conversation that happened at the washing place, the gossip, the news, the social interaction of the women who spent the washing day together at the river or the communal trough was the social dimension of the laundry work that the literary and historical record documents with the warmth of something genuinely valued. Chapter 6. The skin, parasites, vermin, and the medieval body's uninvited residents. You have company, not the company of the people around you, the company that is living on you. In the medieval world, the human body was not the relatively pest-free environment that the modern person, with their weekly showers and their washed clothing and their heated homes with their sealed walls, inhabits. The medieval human body was an environment, a warm, nutrient-rich, shelter-providing environment that multiple species of small organisms had identified as an ideal habitat and had colonized with the specific efficiency of organisms that have been doing this for as long as humans have existed. The louse, specifically the human louse, Pediculus humanus, in its body louse and head louse forms, was the most universal of the medieval body's uninvited residents. Lice were essentially universal in the medieval population, present on virtually everyone to varying degrees, managed by the grooming practices that the medieval household developed, but never eliminated except temporarily. The specific evidence for the universality of medieval louse infestation is documentary. The medieval medical literature discusses lice management with the matter-of-fact frequency of a topic that everyone is dealing with. And archaeological, with the louse combs that the archaeological record produces from every social level of the medieval world, from the peasant's comb to the elaborate ivory comb of the wealthy. The louse comb, the fine-toothed comb, whose teeth were spaced closely enough to catch the lice, and their eggs as the comb passed through the hair, was the standard anti-louse technology of the medieval period, and it was used regularly in the specific grooming practice of the fine comb treatment that the household management literature recommended for hair care. The medieval person who sat while another person fine-combed their hair was engaged in the specific grooming activity that reduced the louse population without eliminating it, maintaining the infestation at a manageable level rather than removing it entirely. The social grooming that the fine-combing represented, the specific intimacy of the grooming relationship, one person combing another's hair, was both a practical hygiene measure and a social bonding activity in the specific way that the primate grooming behavior from which it descends was both practical and social. The medieval manuscript illustrations that show ladies combing each other's hair are showing a genuine social practice, not merely a decorative one, and the specific social warmth of the grooming relationship was a real dimension of the medieval intimate social bond. The louse was not merely an itch, it was a disease, vector. The body louse in particular is the vector for the transmission of epidemic typhus, the disease caused by Rickettsia prowazekii, transmitted in the feces of the infected louse when the louse feces is scratched into the wound created by the louse bite. Typhus, the specific disease of the crowded louse-infested population, was one of the most significant epidemic diseases of the pre-modern world, and its transmission through the louse was the direct consequence of the universal louse infestation of the medieval population. The flea, Pulex irritans, the human flea, and Catinocephalides felis, the cat flea, whose range extended to humans in the specific circumstances of the close human-animal cohabitation of the medieval household, was the other ubiquitous medieval parasite, and it occupied the medieval home, as well as the medieval body. The flea lived in the bedding, the floor rushes, the animal areas of the house, and it moved between the animals and the humans with the specific ease of a small, agile organism that found the distinction between human and animal hosts not particularly relevant to its nutritional requirements. The medieval bed was a flea habitat. The straw mattress, the wool blankets, the specific warm, organic environment of the medieval bed was the ideal flea habitat, and the presence of fleas in the bed was sufficiently universal that the medieval household management literature addressed it directly with the specific remedies that were supposed to discourage the flea from the sleeping space. The herbs spread in the bedding, lavender, fleabane, tansy, were the specific plant materials that the medieval tradition identified as flea repellents. The effectiveness was partial. The fleas were not entirely deterred. The flea was also a disease vector, not in the same way as the louse, but in the specific way that made the flea the most consequential parasite in human history. The rat flea, Xenopsilla chiapis, was the primary vector of the bubonic plague, the disease caused by Yersinia pestis that the flea transmitted from the infected rat to the human host when the rat died, and the flea, seeking a new blood source, bit the human in proximity to the dead rat. The Black Death of 1347 to 1351. The epidemic that killed between a third and a half of the European population was transmitted by the flea in the specific mechanism of the flea's blood meal on the infected rat, and the subsequent bite on the human. The medieval person's inability to escape the flea was the medieval person's inability to escape the plague vector, and the specific connection between the flea-infested, rat-dense environment of the medieval town and the catastrophic plague mortality of the 14th century is the specific connection between the parasitic reality of the medieval body's environment and the most devastating epidemic in European history. The medieval response to the plague's association with the dirty and the disordered, the specific medieval understanding of the plague as connected to the corrupt and contaminated environment was not entirely wrong in its practical implication, even though the specific mechanism that the medieval medical tradition identified was incorrect. The miasma theory, the understanding that the plague was transmitted through corrupt air arising from decaying matter, was wrong about the mechanism, but was generating the correct practical inference that the environment of decay and accumulation that the flea and the rat inhabited was associated with the plague. The bedbugs, Cimex lectularius, were the other common parasite of the medieval sleeping space, and their presence in the medieval bed was documented with the resigned tone of the person describing something that is unpleasant and unavoidable. The bedbug's habit of hiding in the crevices of the bed frame during the day and emerging at night to feed on the sleeping occupant was the specific behavior that made them difficult to eliminate from the medieval wooden bed. The joints and the crevices of the bed frame provided the ideal hiding places that the medieval household's cleaning methods could not adequately reach. The medieval remedies for bedbugs were various and of variable effectiveness: the application of heat, the washing of the bedding, the specific herbal preparations that the household management literature recommended, the application of certain aromatic plants to the crevices of the bed frame where the bugs hid was the specific treatment whose partial effectiveness reflected the genuine fumigant properties of some of the recommended plants. None of these remedies eliminated the problem. They managed it. The medieval person's relationship with the parasites on and around their body was the relationship of the medieval person with any chronic, unavoidable, uncomfortable feature of their material world. The management of the discomfort through the available means, the acceptance of the baseline level that the management couldn't reduce below, and the specific cultural accommodation of the chronic condition that made it a normal rather than an exceptional feature of daily life. The itching was there. The scratching was habitual. The specific discomfort was managed and lived with. The skin conditions that the parasitic infestation produced, the itching, the rash, the secondary infection of the scratched bite, were part of the general skin health landscape of the medieval population, alongside the other skin conditions that the medieval world's hygiene situation produced. The ringworm, the scabies, the various fungal skin conditions that the combination of inadequate bathing, shared clothing, and close physical contact produced were conditions that the medieval medical literature addresses with the specific combination of genuine therapeutic effort and genuine therapeutic limitation that characterizes medieval medicine generally. Chapter 7. The hair, medieval hair care, grooming, and the specific relationship with what was on top of the head. The medieval person cared about their hair. This is worth establishing before describing the specific challenges of medieval hair management, because the popular image of the medieval person, the tangled, dirty, unkempt hair of the generic, unwashed medieval peasant, obscures the genuine attention that the medieval culture gave to hair as an element of personal appearance and personal identity. Hair was significant. The medieval understanding of hair was the understanding of a culture that treated personal appearance as a legitimate concern, and that had developed specific cultural codes about what the hair's condition, style, and management communicated about the person who wore it, the social meaning of the hairstyle, the specific signals about gender, about social status, about marital status, about religious identity, was a developed and meaningful code in the medieval world, and the management of the hair to communicate the appropriate social signal was a real concern of the medieval person at every social level. The hair of the medieval man was managed by the barber, the specific professional whose services included the cutting of hair, the trimming and shaping of the beard, the various grooming services that the medieval male's personal appearance required and that the barber's shop provided. The barber was a ubiquitous figure of the medieval town, his shop a social gathering place, as well as a professional service establishment. The conversation of the barber's chair, the specific social interaction that the shop's function as a news exchange, as well as a haircut venue produced. The specific haircuts that the medieval period favored varied by period, by social class, and by regional tradition. The bowl cut of the medieval peasant, the more elaborate styles of the nobility, the specific tonsure of the clergy that indicated their religious status through the specific shaving of the crown of the head. The tonsure, the shaving of the top of the head that marked the ordained cleric, was the specific hair management practice that distinguished the religious from the secular, the visible identifier of clerical status that the medieval church maintained as a boundary marker. The beard management of the medieval male was another dimension of the barber's professional domain and another element of the medieval male's social identity. The specific beard styles that different periods and social groups favored. The full beard, the neatly trimmed beard, the clean-shaven face of the knight whose armor's helmet required a smooth face beneath it, were the visual vocabulary of the medieval male's social identity, and the management of the beard to produce the appropriate style was a regular visit to the barbers. The medieval woman's hair management was a different and more private affair. The medieval convention that respectable married women covered their hair in public, the specific meaning of the uncovered female hair as the marker of the unmarried, the young, or the disreputable, meant that the elaborate management of the female hair was a private performance rather than a public one. The hair covered by the veil or the wimple or the various head coverings that the medieval female dress code required of the married woman. The hair washing for the medieval woman was the specific occasion for the uncovering and the management of the hair that was otherwise covered, and the washing and dressing of the hair was a significant element of the personal care routine that the medieval woman performed in the private space of the bedchamber. The specific preparations for hair washing, the herbal rinses, the egg-based conditioners, the vinegar rinses that reduced the soap's alkaline residue and restored the hair's natural condition are documented in the household management literature and in the medical texts that address the management of the female hair as a legitimate concern. The oil treatments that the medieval tradition recommended for hair management, the application of various plant oils to the hair as both a conditioning treatment and a specific remedy for the dryness that the cleaning process produced, are the medieval predecessors of the modern hair conditioning treatment, and some of the specific oils recommended: olive oil, almond oil, the various plant oils that the medieval apothecary provided, are oils that the modern hair care industry continues to value for exactly the properties that the medieval tradition had empirically identified. The lice management in the hair was the specific dimension of medieval hair care that the fine-toothed comb addressed, and the regularity with which the medieval household management literature recommends the fine combing of the hair is the specific evidence of the regularity with which the louse was a problem requiring management. The fine comb passed through the hair removed the lice and the nits, the louse eggs cemented to the hair shaft, by the mechanical action of the teeth trapping and removing them as the comb passed through. The specific medieval remedies for head lice, the preparations of vinegar, of specific plant oils, of herbal treatments whose properties included the killing or repelling of lice, were the pest control preparations that the medieval household applied to the hair in the specific context of the anti-louse treatment. Some of these preparations had genuine insecticidal properties. The pyrethrin that the chrysanthemum family's plants contain, for example, is a genuine insecticide that the medieval use of certain flower preparations was exploiting without knowing the specific active compound. Others were the wishful thinking of the person desperate to solve a problem that the available tools could only manage, not eliminate. The NIT, the louse egg cemented to the hair shaft, was the specific challenge that the fine comb addressed, and that the herbal treatments struggled to dissolve. The knit's cement was genuinely resistant to the medieval preparations, and the removal of the nite by hand, the individual picking of the eggs from the hair shaft, the manual delousing that the medieval grooming relationship involved, was the specific intimate activity that the close examination of another person's hair that the medieval grooming relationship involved. The picking of the nites was a time-consuming, careful, genuinely intimate activity. The specific work of the medieval delousing that was both a hygiene measure and a social bonding activity. The specific medieval preparations for hair fragrance, the applications of rosewater, of herbal waters, of the various fragrant preparations that the medieval household produced from the herbs of the garden, were the hair management activities that addressed the specific social concern about the scent of the hair in the social contexts where the uncovered hair was present. The fragrant hair was the desirable hair, and the preparations that produced it were the legitimate cosmetic technologies of the medieval personal care tradition. The hat and the head covering were the specific textile technologies that managed the hair's condition between washings, protecting it from the environmental soiling that the outdoor medieval environment produced, and maintaining the specific social presentation that the medieval dress code required. The variety of medieval head coverings, the wimple, the veil, the coif, the chaperon, the various elaborate constructions of the medieval hat tradition, were simultaneously fashion items and practical head covering that managed the hair's condition in the specific way that covering it from the outdoor environment preserved. The hair management of the medieval world was, in summary, the hair management of a culture that cared about hair, that had developed specific practices for its maintenance, that struggled with the specific parasitic challenge that the louse presented, and that managed all of this within the specific material constraints of the medieval world's available technologies. The medieval hair was not the wild, unkempt disaster of the popular imagination. It was managed, cared for, styled to the appropriate social standard, and troubled by the specific parasitic reality of the medieval environment in ways that the management could reduce but not eliminate. Chapter 8. The Medicine. How medieval medicine approached hygiene-related illness. The doctor is looking at your urine, not metaphorically, literally, physically examining the small flask of your urine that you have brought to the consultation in the specific way that the medieval medical tradition required you to bring it. The flask, the matula, the characteristic glass or ceramic vessel that was the symbol of the medical profession in the medieval period, is being held up to the light. The physician turning it slowly, examining the color, the clarity, the consistency, the specific visual properties of the liquid that the medieval diagnostic tradition treated as the primary window into the body's internal condition. The physician is not going to touch you. Not yet, possibly not at all, depending on the specific circumstances of the consultation and the specific physician's approach to the physical examination. The medieval consultation was organized around the information that could be gathered without the direct physical contact that the modern clinical examination requires, and the urine examination was the primary diagnostic tool precisely because it provided substantial information about the body's condition without requiring the physician to examine the body directly. This is important context for understanding medieval medicine's approach to hygiene-related illness, because the diagnostic framework that the medieval physician used, the humoral theory that identified disease as the result of humoral imbalance rather than the infection by specific microorganisms, was a framework that had no concept of the germ. The medieval physician examining your urine was looking for evidence of humoral imbalance. They were not looking for evidence of bacterial infection, viral infection, or any of the specific pathological agents that the modern physician's diagnostic framework has taught us to identify. The implications for the management of hygiene-related illness were significant and in most cases unfortunate. The medieval physician who encountered a patient suffering from the waterborne diarrheal illness that the contaminated water supply had produced was treating a condition whose cause, the specific pathogen in the specific contaminated water source, was invisible and conceptually inaccessible within the available theoretical framework. The treatment was the treatment of the symptoms in the humoral framework, the dietary adjustments, the herbal preparations, the specific medical interventions that the imbalanced humors required, rather than the treatment of the cause. The specific preparations that the medieval medical tradition used for the hygiene-related illnesses were a mixture of the genuinely effective and the genuinely ineffective in the specific proportions that the empirical tradition of the medieval pharmacopoeia had arrived at through centuries of observation without adequate theory. The astringent preparations for diarrhea, the tannin-containing herbs that the medical tradition prescribed for the loose bowel condition, were addressing the symptom with preparations whose mechanism the modern understanding of tannin's astringent action on the gut mucosa can explain, even though the medieval practitioner's explanation was the humoral one, about the correction of the excessively moist and cold condition that the diarrhea represented. The specific herbal preparations for skin conditions related to the parasitic infestation, the preparations for the management of the itch, the inflammation, the secondary infection of the scratched parasite bite, were similarly the products of centuries of empirical observation, and some of them contained genuinely active compounds. The sulfur preparations that the medieval tradition used for the skin conditions of scabies, the itch mite infestation, whose similarity to the general condition of the itchy, parasite-infested medieval skin was sufficient for the medieval diagnostician to occasionally confuse them, were sulfur-containing preparations whose genuine acaricidal properties the modern pharmaceutical application of sulfur-based treatments for scabies confirms. The dietary medicine was the primary approach to illness management in the medieval tradition, and the dietary advice that the medieval medical texts provided for the prevention of illness was often hygiene adjacent in ways that the medieval practitioner would not have framed in hygiene terms. The recommendation to eat fresh food, to avoid putrefied meat, to drink clean water, the specific dietary advice that the medical tradition generated from the observation that certain foods in certain conditions produced illness, was generating practical hygiene guidance from a theoretical framework that couldn't explain why the guidance was correct. The avoidance of putrefied food as a cause of illness. One of the few areas where the medieval miasma theories, emphasis on the corrupt and decaying as the source of disease, pointed in the correct practical direction, was the specific dietary advice that the medieval medical tradition was capable of generating and enforcing. The corrupt meat, the spoiled fish, the food that smelled wrong, these were correctly identified as disease, risks, even though the mechanism by which they caused illness was not the miasma of corruption, but the specific bacterial contamination that the spoilage represented. The plague management that the medieval medical tradition developed in response to the Black Death is one of the more instructive examples of the practical measures that the medieval medical community could generate even from the wrong theoretical framework. The quarantine, the isolation of the infected to prevent spread, was the specific public health measure that the Republic of Venice developed in 1377, and while the medieval understanding of why it worked was the understanding of the miasma theory, that the corrupted air of the infected person should not be allowed to reach the healthy. The practical effect was the correct one of limiting the transmission of the disease, the fumigation that the medieval plague management employed, the burning of aromatic herbs and resins in the sick room, the use of specific fumigants to drive away the corrupt air, was the practical application of the miasma theory that produced an occasional genuine fumigant effect. The burning of juniper and rosemary produced volatile compounds with genuine antimicrobial properties, and the fumigation of the sick room with these materials was doing something, even if it was doing something much less effective than the germ theory-based infection control measures that would eventually replace it. The specific personal hygiene advice of the medieval medical tradition was organized around the concept of the regimen sanitatis, the healthy lifestyle, the specific set of behaviors that the medical tradition identified as conducive to health. The 6 non-naturals, the 6 categories of environmental and behavioral factors that the medieval medical tradition identified as the primary determinants of health, included air, food and drink, sleep and waking, motion and rest, retention and excretion, and the passions of the soul. And the management of each of these categories in the medically correct way was the medieval physician's primary preventive health advice. The excretion category is the one most directly relevant to the hygiene topic, and the medieval medical advice about excretion was the advice of a tradition that understood the body's waste products as the specific materials that needed to be correctly and regularly expelled to maintain health. The specific advice about regular bowel function, about adequate urination, about the sweating that bathing and exercise produced. These were the medical recommendations that the humoral framework generated about the body's excretory function, and they were generating practical hygiene. Adjacent advice from a theoretical framework that connected the body's waste management to the maintenance of humoral balance. The sweating bath, the specific therapeutic measure of the heated bath designed to produce sweating, which the medieval medical tradition valued as a cleansing measure, was both a hygiene practice and a medical treatment in the medieval understanding, the two functions being inseparable within the framework that treated bodily cleanliness and bodily health as aspects of the same humoral management problem. The person who took the sweating bath was both cleaning themselves and treating the humoral imbalance that the accumulated waste products of the body represented, and the distinction between the hygienic and the therapeutic dimensions of the bath was a distinction that the medieval framework didn't make. The leprosy management of the medieval period is one of the more historically significant intersections of disease and hygiene in the medieval world, and it illuminates the specific ways in which the medieval medical and social tradition managed the specific fear of contagion that certain highly visible skin conditions generated. Leprosy, or rather the range of conditions that the medieval diagnostic tradition grouped under the label of leprosy, which included genuine leprosy and numerous other skin conditions that the diagnostic imprecision of the period couldn't distinguish, was managed through the specific social exclusion of the diagnosed leper. The leper's exclusion from the general community, the requirement to live in the leprosarium, to wear the distinctive cloak and rattle, to announce their presence so that the healthy could avoid contact, was the specific medieval public health measure for managing the spread of the condition that the medieval medical tradition had identified as highly contagious. The specific mechanism by which leprosy spreads, the prolonged close contact that allows the Mycobacterium leprae to transmit between individuals, was not known to the medieval medical tradition, but the practical measure of isolating the infected was the correct practical application of the observation that leprosy was more common in the households where lepers lived than in households without them. The irony of the medieval leprosy management was its specific inconsistency. The leper who was formally excluded from the community was, in many practical social contexts, not excluded at all, but present in the marketplace and the church and the street in ways that the formal exclusion policy was supposed to prevent. The management of the formal policy by the actual social practice was the specific medieval gap between the institutional response and the lived reality that the historical record of leper interactions with the general community confirms. The hospital, the medieval institution for the care of the sick, was the specific institutional response to the hygiene-related illness that the urban medieval environment produced in quantities that exceeded the capacity of the individual household to manage. The medieval hospital, as we have established in other contexts, was primarily a religious institution, or the religious house that provided care for the sick as a work of Christian charity. And its management of the sick combined the medical treatment of the available tradition with the spiritual care of the religious institution. The specific hygiene of the medieval hospital was better than the hygiene of the average medieval household in some respects, and not better in others. The dedicated washing of the patients, the changing of the bedding at intervals that the hospital's resources permitted, the separation of the different categories of illness in the specific way that the larger hospital's organization allowed. These were hygiene measures that the individual household couldn't always achieve. The concentration of the ill in the same space, the sharing of the ward's air, and the ward's water and the ward's basic facilities. These were the hospital's specific hygiene risks, the crowding of the ill that the hospital's function inevitably produced. Chapter 9. To smell management, the specific technologies. The medieval world used to manage odor. The medieval world smelled, and it knew it smelled, and it had opinions about the smelling. The popular narrative of medieval hygiene sometimes implies that the medieval person was indifferent to the smells of their world, that the universal background of the ambient medieval odor produced a general olfactory tolerance that made the specific bad smells invisible. This is not entirely wrong. The olfactory adaptation to the chronic smell was real, and the medieval person's baseline threshold for noticing and objecting to smells was different from the modern person's. But it is not entirely right either. The medieval world had smell preferences. It had smell aversions. It had a developed cultural vocabulary for describing the good smell and the bad smell, and the specific social meanings that the smell of the person communicated. And it had a range of specific technologies: the aromatic, herbs, the fragrant waters, the scented preparations of the apothecary, for managing the smells that the body and the environment produced in ways that the cultural preferences of the period found unacceptable. The aromatic herb was the primary smell management technology of the medieval world, deployed in every context where smell management was a concern. In the church, where the incense that the liturgical tradition burned was performing both the religious function of the offering and the practical function of managing the specific smell of the large congregation of bodies in an enclosed space. In the household, where the herbs strewn in the rushes on the floor, the lavender, the rosemary, the meadow sweet, the various aromatic plants that the household tradition had identified as effective floor fragrance, were providing the specific olfactory improvement of the crushed herb over the unbuffered, organic material of the Russian animal floor. The pomander was the personal smell management technology of the upper-class medieval person. The specific small container of aromatic materials held in the hand or worn around the neck, whose fragrance the wearer kept close to their nose in the specific social contexts where the ambient smell required the personal countermeasure of the carried fragrance. The pomander was simultaneously a personal hygiene accessory, a fashion item, and a medical device. The medieval understanding of the miasma theory made the fragrant substances of the pomander a genuine disease prevention measure, the specific barrier against the corrupt air that the pomander's fragrance was supposed to provide. The rose water that the medieval household produced from the roses of the summer garden was the specific liquid fragrance preparation that the household management literature describes as a standard domestic product, used in the cooking, in the personal care, and in the household fragrance management that the daily domestic routine required. The distillation of rosewater was a household skill that the more elaborate domestic management included, and the specific fragrance of the rosewater was the specific olfactory marker of the clean, managed, carefully maintained domestic environment that the medieval social standard expected. The strewing herbs, the specific plants scattered on the floor or on the bedding for their fragrance and their pest-repelling properties, were the household smell management technology that served the double function of the aromatic and the practical. The lavender in the bedding was providing fragrance and insect repellent simultaneously, the specific volatile compounds of the lavender plant deterring the moths and the fleas with the same chemical mechanism that was producing the fragrance. The medieval multitasking herb was doing two jobs at once, and the household management tradition that recommended it was correct about both jobs. The perfumed glove, the specific fashion item of the wealthy medieval and early modern person. The glove scented with the expensive, fragrant preparations of the apothecary was the personal smell management technology that the fashion and the hygiene concerns of the upper-class medieval person combined into the specific artifact of the perfumed accessory. The wearing of scented gloves was the specific personal hygiene measure of the hand's smell management. the smell of the hands, which were in constant contact with the world, and absorbed its smells in the specific way that the organic material of the skin and the spaces beneath the fingernails did. Dressed in the fragrant preparation that the social context of the upper-class interaction required, the fumigation of the sick room, the burning of the aromatic herbs that the miasma theory recommended as the specific countermeasure against the corrupt air of the illness, was the medical version of the smell management technology. The specific application of the aromatic herb in the context of the illness that the miasma theory identified as the smell of corruption, the burning of juniper, of rosemary, of the specific herbs that the medical tradition recommended for the fumigation of the sick room, was doing the smell management that the medical theory required, and in the specific case of the genuinely antimicrobial aromatic compounds, it was doing something genuinely useful alongside the primarily olfactory function. The vinegar carried by the plague physician, the specific preparation that the doctor held to their nose in the infected areas, contained in the beak of the characteristic plague doctor's mask, was the medieval personal protective equipment of the smell management tradition applied to the specific context of the epidemic. The long beak of the plague doctor's mask was filled with the aromatic herbs and the vinegar that were supposed to filter the corrupt air before it reached the physician's airways, and while the mechanism was wrong, the plague was not transmitted by the corrupt air but by the flea. The specific effect was not entirely without value in the context of some of the secondary infections that the crowded, ill environment of the plague hospital produced. The personal fragrance, the perfume, the scented preparation applied to the body as a personal fragrance measure, was the luxury personal smell management technology of the wealthy medieval person. And the perfume tradition of the medieval world was sophisticated enough to produce the specific complex preparations that the apothecary offered and that the wealthy consumer used. The rosewater and the lavender water were the accessible end of the personal fragrance spectrum. The imported exotic resins, the frankincense, the myrrh, the ambergris, the musk, were the expensive end, available to the very wealthy and used in the specific preparations of the apothecary's fragrance offerings. The specific social function of the personal fragrance was the function of the olfactory social signal. The smell of the well-maintained, fragrance-managed person communicating the social status and the personal care that the fragrance represented. The medieval social code's association of good smell with high status and bad smell with low status was the specific olfactory expression of the social hierarchy that connected the access to the smell management resources with the social position that determined the access. The wealthy person who could afford the rosewater and the pomander smelled better than the poor person who couldn't, and the smell difference was readable by everyone who encountered them. Chapter 10. The surprisingly good. The aspects of medieval hygiene that were better than you expect. Brace yourself. We are about to say some positive things about medieval hygiene, not because the script has lost its nerve, not because the previous chapters have been unfair. The cesspit was real. The lice were real. The dental situation was genuinely concerning. But the honest history of medieval hygiene requires acknowledging the specific aspects of medieval personal care and public health that were better than the popular narrative allows, because the popular narrative's comprehensive negativity is as misleading as the opposite extreme of the sanitized romantic version. The medieval diet, the specific diet of the majority of the medieval population, was in important respects better for the skin, the teeth, and the gut than the modern diet, whose hygiene advantages have not entirely compensated for its nutritional disadvantages. The absence of refined sugar from the ordinary medieval diet was a genuine tooth health advantage, as we have established. The high fiber content of the medieval diet, the whole grain breads, the legumes, the root vegetables, the variety of plant foods that the medieval peasant's garden and the medieval hedgerow provided, was a genuine gut health advantage that the modern diet's processed food content has reduced. The fermented foods of the medieval diet, the soured milk products, the fermented grain preparations, the vinegar-pickled vegetables that the preservation tradition relied on, were providing the specific probiotic benefit of the live bacterial cultures that the modern food culture has rediscovered as the kombucha and the kimchi and the kefir of the contemporary health food market. The medieval diet's fermented component was unintentionally doing what the modern probiotic supplement deliberately attempts. And the gut microbiome of the medieval person who regularly consumed fermented dairy and fermented grain was a gut microbiome with a specific bacterial diversity that the modern over-sanitized, antibiotic medicated gut microbiome sometimes lacks. The walking that the medieval life required, the specific physical activity of the pedestrian world, the farmer in the field, the merchant walking the trade routes, the pilgrim covering the miles to the shrine, was providing the specific cardiovascular and metabolic benefit of the sustained moderate exercise that the modern sedentary lifestyle has reduced to a public health concern. The medieval person was not deliberately exercising for health. They were moving because the medieval world required movement to function in it, but the health benefits of the movement were real, regardless of the intentionality of the exercise. The outdoor time that the agricultural medieval life provided, the specific exposure to sunlight that the field worker and the garden worker accumulated through the working day, was providing the vitamin D synthesis that the modern indoor lifestyle has reduced to a widespread deficiency in northern populations. The medieval farm workers' vitamin D status was probably better than the modern office workers, despite the complete absence of vitamin D supplements, because the sun exposure that the outdoor agricultural work provided was synthesizing the vitamin through the skin with the specific efficiency of sustained outdoor exposure. The hand washing that the medieval meal culture required, the specific washing of hands before eating that the medieval household management literature consistently recommended, that the monastic tradition enforced through the lavabo ritual, that the medieval etiquette texts identified as a standard expectation of the properly managed meal, was a genuine hygiene measure whose frequency in the medieval record contradicts the image of the medieval person who never washed anything. The medieval instruction to wash the hands before eating appears in texts ranging from the household management literature to the medical texts to the etiquette manuals, and its repetition across multiple genres of medieval writing suggests that the expectation was real and the practice was sufficiently standard to be worth mentioning as an expectation. The hand washing was not the thorough soap and water 20-second scrub of the modern hand hygiene protocol. It was a rinse in clean water, sometimes with the addition of herbal preparations, sometimes with the rose water of the more elaborate household. But it was hand washing, and its pre-meal performance was the specific hygiene measure that the meal culture required. The food safety management of the medieval kitchen, the specific practices that the medieval cook employed to maintain the safety of the food being prepared, was a genuine body of practical knowledge that the kitchen management tradition had developed from the empirical observation of what food practices produced illness and what food practices didn't. The avoidance of meat that smelled wrong, the specific recommendation for thorough cooking of certain foods, the specific cooling and covering of prepared food to delay the spoilage that the summer heat accelerated. These were the practical food safety measures of the medieval kitchen, generated from observation rather than from microbiology, but pointing in the generally correct direction. The monastery's approach to hygiene was, in some respects, an example of the medieval institution getting hygiene significantly better than the general population. The Benedictine rules requirement of regular hand washing, the lavabo before meals, the washing before certain liturgical functions, created a routine of hand washing that the monastic community practiced consistently throughout the year. The monastery's management of its water supply, the piped water systems that the larger and wealthier monasteries constructed, the careful separation of the water sources from the waste disposal in the institutional planning, was infrastructure that exceeded the average medieval town's water management. The Islamic world's hygiene standards, relevant to the medieval story because the Islamic world was the medieval world's most advanced civilization in multiple respects, including medicine and public hygiene, were in many respects considerably superior to the Christian European medieval standard. The Islamic religious requirement of ritual purity, the specific washing requirements that the Quran and the Hadith prescribed before prayer, after certain bodily functions, before handling certain sacred objects, created a routine of bodily washing that the Islamic medical tradition reinforced with the specific health advice of the humoral framework's Islamic interpretation. The hammam, the Islamic public bathhouse, modeled on the Roman bath tradition and developed into the specific institution of the Turkish bath and its regional variants, was a public hygiene institution whose standards the medieval European bathhouse didn't always match. The hammam's specific sequence of bathing spaces, from the warm room to the hot room to the cooling room, the specific attendants who performed the bathing service, the regular maintenance of the facilities, created a bathing experience of genuine quality and genuine hygiene benefit that the European medieval bathhouse approximated but didn't consistently achieve. The specific medical texts of the Islamic tradition that the medieval European medical education incorporated through the translation movement, the works of Avicenna, of Al-Razi, of the Islamic medical tradition that had synthesized and extended the classical Greek medical tradition, included specific hygiene advice, whose quality exceeded the European traditions in certain respects. The advice about the regular bathing, the cleaning of the teeth, the management of the bodily functions. In Avicenna's Canon of Medicine was incorporated into the European medical curriculum through the translation movement that made the Islamic medical texts available to the European medical schools, and the hygiene advice that the European medical student absorbed from Avicenna was advice of genuine quality. Chapter 11. The turning point, when medieval hygiene began to change, and why something changed in the 14th century. Not everything, not the sudden arrival of the modern hygiene standard, not the overnight transformation of the medieval world into something recognizably modern in its relationship with cleanliness, but something specific, connected to the specific catastrophic event of the 14th century that we have already mentioned several times in this script, because its implications were so comprehensive that it touched every aspect of medieval life, including the specific aspect of personal and public hygiene. The Black Death changed the medieval world's relationship with hygiene and disease in ways that were both immediate and long-term, and the specific changes it produced were not entirely in the direction of improvement. The immediate response to the plague, the frantic search for the cause and the cure that the medieval medical tradition conducted in the face of a disease that exceeded the available theoretical framework's capacity to explain, produced specific hygiene-adjacent interventions alongside the interventions that were genuinely wrong. The Galenic medical tradition's response to the plague included the recommendation to avoid the corrupt air, to flee the infected areas, to burn fragrant materials to purify the air, to maintain physical distance from the infected. These recommendations were partly right by accident. The physical distance from the infected reduced contact with the infected person's fleas, reducing the transmission risk in ways that the miasma theory couldn't explain, but that the plague's actual mechanism supports. The flight from the infected area was the specific behavioral response that the wealthy and the mobile could execute, and that the poor couldn't. And the plague's differential mortality between the wealthy who fled and the poor who stayed was partly the differential access to the one behavioral intervention that actually helped. The plague's specific demographic impact, the death of between a third and a half of the European population in the initial outbreak and significant additional mortality in the subsequent outbreaks, produced the specific economic conditions that the labor shortage of the post-plague period created, and the labor shortage had hygiene implications that were complex and not entirely negative. The increased wages that the labor shortage produced for surviving workers meant increased purchasing power, which meant access to better food and better living conditions, and, to some extent, better personal care resources. The the post-plague standard of living for the surviving working population was, in many respects, higher than the pre-plague standard, and the hygiene baseline rose slightly with it. The water infrastructure improvements that the growing cities of the late medieval and early modern period invested in were the specific institutional response to the specific problem that the medieval city's combination of dense population and inadequate sanitation had created, and that the plague had demonstrated with catastrophic clarity. The conduit systems that brought clean water from outside the city, the specific infrastructure projects of the 14th and 15th century English and European cities, were the urban investment in hygiene infrastructure that the Black Death's demonstration of the connection between urban crowding, contaminated water, and mass death had made politically possible to fund. London's water infrastructure improvements in the later medieval period, the specific conduits and water sources that the city invested in from the 13th century onward, were the institutional response to the specific problem that the Thames could not adequately serve as both the water supply and the waste disposal system of a city of 80,000 people. The specific infrastructure solutions that the medieval city found, the piped water from cleaner sources, the conduit head systems that distributed the water to public fountains, were partial and imperfect, but they represented a genuine institutional engagement with the hygiene problem that the urban density had created. The Renaissance's engagement with the classical tradition, the recovery of the Roman medical texts, the specific return to the classical understanding of hygiene that the Italian humanist movement of the 14th and 15th centuries promoted, produced a specific renewed emphasis on the bathing and the exercise and the diet management that the classical tradition had valued. The Renaissance physician who prescribed regular bathing as a health measure was prescribing it within the framework of the recovered classical tradition, and the specific Renaissance enthusiasm for the bathing that the Roman bath tradition had practiced was a cultural recovery of a hygiene standard that the early medieval period had partially abandoned in the specific context of the ascetic tradition's suspicious view of bodily comfort. The printing press, the specific technology that Gutenberg developed in the 1440s, and that transformed the distribution of information across Europe in the subsequent decades, was the information technology that made the hygienic medical advice available to a significantly larger population than the manuscript culture had reached. The printed health advice books, the regimen sanitatis texts that the early printing houses produced in multiple editions for the growing literate market, were disseminating the medical tradition's hygiene advice to households that the manuscript culture's expensive and rare texts had never reached. The household book, the printed guide to domestic management that the 15th and 16th century publishing industry produced for the literate household, included the hygiene advice of the medical tradition, alongside the cooking recipes and the gardening guidance, and the specific reach of the printed book into the literate middle-class household was the specific mechanism by which the hygiene standards of the learned tradition were transmitted to the households that the expensive physician had never visited. The germ theory of disease, the specific theoretical revolution that Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch produced in the second half of the 19th century, was the intellectual event that finally provided the correct theoretical framework for understanding the specific connection between hygiene and disease that the empirical observation had been generating correctly and explaining incorrectly for the entire medieval period. The germ theory identified the specific microorganisms that the medieval tradition's miasma theory had gestured toward as the corrupt air, giving the disease a specific identifiable cause that the specific hygiene measures could address with the directed effectiveness that the miasma theory's unfocused countermeasures couldn't achieve. The specific implications for hygiene were immediate and dramatic. Once the germ theory established that the specific pathogens in the specific contaminated water were causing the specific waterborne diseases, the engineering of the sewage system and the water treatment infrastructure became the specific public health priority that the 19th century sanitary reform movement had been advocating, and that the germ theory now provided the theoretical justification for. The London sewer system that Joseph Bazalgette built in the 1860s, the specific engineering response to the Great Stink of 1858, when the Thames's condition in the summer heat made the Houses of Parliament barely functional, was the specific infrastructure solution to the specific problem that the medieval city had been creating and managing imperfectly for 700 years. The hand-washing that Ignaz Semmelweis demonstrated could prevent the childbed fever that was killing the mothers in the Vienna maternity hospital in the 1840s. The specific data-supported demonstration that the hands of the physician who went directly from the autopsy room to the delivery room were transmitting the infection that was killing the patients was the specific empirical precursor to the germ theory's application to clinical medicine. Semmelweis was largely rejected by his contemporaries, partly because the germ theory hadn't yet provided the mechanism that would explain his observation. When Pasteur and Koch provided the mechanism, the hand-washing became the standard that it remains today. The medieval world had been doing some of this right: the hand-washing before meals, the quarantine of the infected, the flight from the plague area, without the theory that explained why it was right. The theory, when it finally came, confirmed that the empirical observation had been generating the correct practical guidance, even when the explanation was wrong. The medieval person who washed their hands before eating was doing the right thing for the wrong reason. The germ theory told them why it was the right thing. By the time the germ theory arrived, the medieval period had been over for 400 years, but its legacy, the infrastructure, the institutions, the habits of personal care, was the foundation on which the modern hygiene standard was built. Chapter 12. The workplace. Hygiene in the specific environments. Where medieval people spent their working lives, you are at work, and the workplace hygiene situation is, let's be honest about this before we proceed, not great, not catastrophic, not the specific horror of the cesspit or the lice, but not great in the specific way that the working environment of the medieval period produced its own hygiene challenges that were distinct from the domestic hygiene challenges we have been discussing, and that in some cases were significantly worse. The workplace of the medieval period was, for the majority of the population, the outdoor environment, the field, the forest, the market, the building site, the road. The outdoor workplace had specific hygiene properties that were genuinely better than the indoor workshop in certain respects: the fresh air, the dispersal of the biological waste that the confined indoor space concentrated, the specific natural ventilation that the outdoor environment provided. The field worker who was sweating in the August heat was sweating in the open air, and the open air was not recycling that sweat through the enclosed breathing space of 40 other people. But the outdoor workplace had its own specific hygiene challenges. The agricultural worker in the field was working with the animals, whose waste management was the field's problem, as well as the farmyards. The plow team's horses and oxen were depositing their waste in the field where the plowing was happening. And the specific management of the field's waste was not a management that included any of the specific measures that the domestic waste management employed. The field was the field, the waste was in the field, and the work continued around it. The harvest was the specific outdoor workplace hygiene situation that combined the summer heat, the physical labor, the absence of washing facilities, and the close proximity of large numbers of workers in the specific conditions of the communal harvest. The harvest brought together the full labor force of the village, the men and women who came to bring in the grain in the specific urgency of the harvest window. And the specific hygiene conditions of the harvest were the conditions of many bodies in close proximity, doing heavy physical labor in summer heat without the washing facilities that the domestic environment at least offered intermittently. The harvest sweat, the specific accumulated sweat of the working day, absorbed by the wool tunic and the linen undergarment, and compounded by the next day's sweat before the laundry provided any relief, was the specific workplace hygiene product of the agricultural season. The harvest worker who came in from the field at the end of the working day was a harvest worker who had been sweating in wool for 12 hours, and the specific olfactory situation of the harvest supper. The gathered workers, the accumulated day's labor, the summer evening, was an olfactory situation that the modern agricultural show's artisanal harvest recreation does not accurately represent. The tannery was the specific medieval workplace whose hygiene situation the modern visitor would find most immediately overwhelming, and we have mentioned it in the context of the river's contamination without dwelling on the specific conditions inside the tannery itself. The tanning of leather required the processing of the raw hide through a series of chemical baths, whose ingredients included the specific biological materials that the tanning tradition had identified as effective, the urine that provided the alkaline solution for removing the hair from the hide, the animal brains, and the dung that the traditional tanning methods used in various stages of the process, and the bark tannins that gave the tanning its name, and that finally converted the raw hide into the stable, durable leather that the medieval economy required in every context, from the shoe to the saddle to the bookbinding. The tannery worker was working in these materials all day. The specific occupational exposure of the tanner to the ammonia of the urine vats, to the organic materials of the various processing stages, to the specific bacterial load of the fresh hide that arrived from the slaughterhouse. This was the occupational hygiene situation of the tanner, and the medieval tanner's body, after a working day, was the body of a person who had been in contact with these materials for the duration of the working day. The tanners were required to live and work in specific districts of the medieval town. The requirement to situate the tanneries near the river, the specific urban zoning that the town's other residents insisted on to keep the tanneries' smell at a distance, was the medieval urban public health management that the tannery's specific odor profile made necessary. The tanners who lived and worked in the riverside tanning districts were living in the specific urban zone where the combined smell of the tannery, the slaughterhouse, and the river in its maximally contaminated state was the ambient olfactory environment of the working day and the sleeping night. The miller's workplace was the flour mill, and the specific workplace hygiene situation of the miller was the situation of a person who spent their working day in an environment of flour dust, the specific fine particulate that the grinding of grain produced, and that the unventilated mill building concentrated in the air that the miller breathed. The flour dust of the medieval mill was the specific occupational respiratory hazard of the milling trade, and the medieval miller, who had been in the mill for 30 years, was a miller whose lungs contained the specific accumulated deposit of 30 years of flour dust exposure. The miller's appearance was the appearance of the flour-dusted worker, the white coating of the fine flour on the hair, the skin, the clothing, that the constant exposure to the milling environment produced. The medieval stereotype of the dishonest miller, the miller who skimmed the grain of the customers, who brought their grain to be ground, who cheated the measure, who was generally disreputable, included the specific visual detail of the flour-whitened miller as the recognizable physical type of the dishonest tradesman. Chaucer's miller in the Canterbury Tales is described with the specific physical detail of the large, muscular, flour-dusted miller of the medieval imagination. The blacksmith's forge was the specific industrial workplace whose hygiene situation combined the extreme heat, the metal dust, the coal and charcoal smoke, and the specific physical demands of the forge work in the enclosed space of the smithy. The blacksmith working at the forge was working in temperatures that modern occupational health would classify as heat stress environments, in an atmosphere of metal particles and combustion products that the modern respiratory health regulations would require specific protection against, and with the specific physical exposure of the bare arms and the open face to the heat and the sparks of the forge work. The smithy's specific hygiene product, the combination of the forge's heat, the coal smoke, the metal dust, and the physical labor's sweat, was the specific occupational smell and the specific occupational skin condition of the blacksmith. The blacksmith's skin, darkened by the forge's heat, and the coal's soot and the metal's residue, was the specific occupational marker of the trade that the medieval visual and literary tradition recorded. The blacksmith was recognizable by their skin and their smell before they were recognizable by any other marker of their trade. The butcher's workplace, the shambles, was the specific urban workplace whose hygiene conditions the medieval town's municipal regulations addressed most consistently and most urgently, because the shambles was the one workplace whose hygiene failures were most immediately and most dramatically visible and smellable to the entire surrounding population. The blood on the street, the animal parts in the gutter, the specific biological waste of the slaughtering process accumulating in the public space of the shambles. These were the hygiene conditions that the municipal regulations attempted to manage with varying degrees of success. The municipal regulations about the shambles, the specific requirements about where the slaughtering could happen, what had to be done with the waste, how the blood had to be managed, are among the most revealing documents in the medieval public health record because they show the specific awareness of the hygiene problem that the shambles created and the specific imperfection of the institutional response to it. The regulations were issued, the violations were common, the fines were imposed, the violations continued. The shambles remained the shambles, in both the literal and the figurative sense. The surgeon's workplace, the specific operating environment of the medieval barber surgeon, was a workplace whose hygiene conditions the modern surgical theater's standards would find utterly inadequate. The medieval surgical operation was performed in whatever space was available: the patient's bed, the apothecary's back room, the barber's chair, with instruments that were clean in the sense of visibly clean, the blood of previous operations wiped off, but not sterile in the sense that the modern operating theater's instruments are sterile, because the concept of sterility as the absence of microorganisms was not available. The medieval surgeon, who moved from one patient to another without the specific hand washing and instrument sterilization that the germ theory would eventually make standard, was transmitting the pathogens of one patient to the wound of the next with the specific efficiency of the unsterile instrument and the ungloved hand. The wound infection that followed the medieval surgical operation was not an unfortunate complication. It was the predictable consequence of the surgical environment's specific hygiene conditions, occurring with the regularity that the modern surgical theater's infection control measures have reduced to a small fraction of the medieval rate. The monastery's workplace, the scriptorium, the kitchen, the infirmary, the brewery, had specific workplace hygiene conditions that the Benedictine rules' requirements for order and cleanliness partially addressed. The scriptorium's hygiene was the hygiene of the intellectual workplace, the parchment, the ink, the specific materials of the manuscript production, and the specific hygiene challenge was the maintenance of the clean light working environment that the fine work of the manuscript illustration required. The ink-stained hands and the cramped posture of the medieval scribe were the occupational markers of the scriptorium, rather than the specific biological hygiene challenges of the more physically demanding trades. The infirmary's workplace hygiene was the specific challenge of the medieval medical environment that we have discussed in the previous chapter. The management of the ill in the space that the ill occupied, the washing and changing of the patients, the management of the waste that the illness produced. The infirmary was the medieval workplace, where the hygiene challenge was most directly connected to the clinical outcome and the specific hygiene practices of the monastery's infirmary. The regular changing of the patient's linen, the disposal of the waste, were the hygiene practices that made the most direct difference to whether the patients lived or died. The workplace of the medieval physician was the specific working environment of the consultation. The physician's room, the patient's bedside, the specific spaces where the medical encounter happened, and the specific hygiene of the physician's working environment was the hygiene of the person who moved between the sick and the well, with the specific regularity of their professional function. The medieval physician, who conducted multiple consultations in a day, was moving between the sick, who carried the specific pathogens of their illness, and the well who didn't, without the specific hand hygiene protocol that the modern clinical environment requires between patient contacts. The physician's professional survival in the specific disease environment that their work created was the specific evidence of the immune competence that the repeated exposure to the disease environment produced. The occupational immunity that the medieval physician developed through the specific repeated contact with the infectious conditions that they treated. Not complete immunity. Medieval physicians died of the diseases they treated with sufficient frequency to appear in the mortality records of the plague years, but a specific partial resistance that the occupational exposure over time produced in the survivors. Chapter 13. The Class Divide. How medieval hygiene differed dramatically between rich and poor. The wealthy smelled better. This is not a subtle observation. It is the specific, direct, materially determined consequence of the fact that the hygiene resources of the medieval world, the soap, the hot water, the clean linen, the servants, to manage the bathing and the laundry, the garderobe rather than the cesspit, the fresh food that supported healthy skin and teeth, were distributed according to the same hierarchy that distributed every other resource, which is to say, the wealthy had more of them, and the poor had less. The class divide in medieval hygiene was not merely the difference between comfort and discomfort. It was the difference between the specific hygiene conditions that supported life and the specific hygiene conditions that threatened it. The mortality statistics of the medieval period, where they can be reconstructed with any precision, reflect the class gradient of hygiene access in the specific pattern of higher mortality from the waterborne and the parasitic diseases in the poorer urban populations than in the wealthier ones, who had access to the cleaner water sources and the better housing. The wealthy person's water came from the private conduit, the piped water supply that the great household could afford to install, bringing the water from the clean source outside the town to the household's interior distribution point. The wealthy household in the medieval town was not drinking from the same Thames that received the cesspit overflow of the densely populated tenements downstream. It was drinking from the specific conduit that the household's resources had connected to the cleaner upstream source. The poor person's water came from the common conduit, or the river, the water source shared by everyone in the neighborhood and contaminated by the accumulated biological waste of the dense population that shared it. The specific waterborne disease burden of the medieval poor was the disease burden of the contaminated common water source, and the differential mortality between the wealthy and the poor from the waterborne diseases was the mortality difference between the private clean water and the shared contaminated water. The wealthy person's linen was changed frequently. The specific luxury of the multiple linen undergarments that allowed the wealthy person to change the linen that was against their skin every day or every few days was the luxury of the household that had the linen to spare and the servants to wash it. The clean linen that was changed regularly was the specific hygiene measure that made the most difference to the personal cleanliness of the person wearing it, and the wealthy person's access to regular clean linen was a genuine hygiene advantage over the poor person's single undergarment that was worn until the washing day permitted it to be cleaned. The specific number of linen undergarments that the wealthy medieval household maintained is documented in the estate inventories that the medieval record has preserved, and the numbers are striking. The inventory of a prosperous merchant household might list dozens of linen shirts and undergarments, the specific quantity that allowed regular changing while the worn garments were being washed and dried. The inventory of the ordinary peasant household might list one or two, and the household that listed one was the household that wore the garment while it waited for the weather and the time to wash it. The wealthy person's access to the private bath, the wooden tub heated with water that the servants carried and heated in the private space of the bedchamber, was the bathing luxury that the majority of the medieval population accessed only through the public bathhouse or the periodic domestic bath, whose heating required the investment of the household's labor. The wealthy person could bathe as frequently as they chose, at whatever time they chose, in the private comfort of their own bedchamber, with the specific preparations, the aromatic herbs in the water, the heated towels, the post-bath preparations of the household management tradition. that made the bath a genuine comfort experience. The poor person bathed at the public bathhouse on the days when the fee was affordable and the time was available, or at home in the wooden tub with the water heated by whoever had the time to heat it, in the specific domestic conditions that the ordinary household's labor arrangements permitted. The bath was less frequent, less elaborate, less comfortable, and less private. But it happened, and the medieval poor person who bathed at the public bathhouse was doing something that the popular narrative of universal medieval filthiness doesn't accommodate. The wealthy person's food was the food of the household, with the resources to buy the fresh produce, the fresh meat, the variety of ingredients that the balanced diet requires. The skin condition of the person who ate well, whose vitamin and mineral status was adequate because the diet that supported it was adequate, was the skin condition of the person whose nutritional sufficiency expressed itself in the physical markers of health that the well-nourished body produces. The wealthy person's complexion, the specific skin appearance that the medieval beauty ideal valued, was partly the complexion of the well-fed person whose diet was supporting the skin's health in ways that the poor person's narrower diet could not always achieve. The poor person's food was the food of the narrow winter diet, the salt meat, the dried peas, the maslin bread, the reduced variety that the agricultural scarcity of the hungry gap and the economic constraint of the limited income produced. The skin condition of the vitamin-deficient winter diet, the scurvy-adjacent roughness of the skin, the specific appearance of the nutritionally stressed body, was the skin condition of the person whose diet was not supporting the skin's biological requirements. The skin of the medieval poor in February was the skin of the person who had been eating preserved food for 3 months and whose vitamin C status was showing in the physical condition of the connective tissue. The teeth of the wealthy and the teeth of the poor were different in the specific way that we have established. The wealthy person's access to sugar made their teeth more cariogenic, while the poor person's absence of sugar made their teeth less cariogenic, but more worn from the abrasive diet. The wealthy medieval person had more cavities. The poor medieval person had more worn teeth. Both groups had inadequate dental care by modern standards, but the specific failure mode was different by social class. The wealthy person's clothing was the clothing of the household that could afford the more frequent washing of the outer garments, the fine wool that the household's servants maintained, in the specific condition that the social presentation of the great household required. The clothing of the poor person was the clothing worn until the washing was unavoidable, the single outer garment that had to be managed through the interval between washings, with the brushing and airing that were the interval management technologies of the limited wardrobe household. The wealthy person's sleeping space was the enclosed curtained bed that created the specific microclimate of the bed's interior. The warmth of the curtained space, the cleanness of the regularly changed linen, the specific comfort of the feather mattress that the wealthy household maintained. The sleeping space of the poor person was the shared bed or the straw pallet in the communal sleeping space of the longhouse, where the specific hygiene of the shared sleeping was the hygiene of whatever the communal arrangement could manage. The flea in the wealthy person's bed was a flea that the household's specific anti-flea measures, the lavender in the bedding, the regular changing of the straw, the cats whose hunting the household encouraged, had partially reduced. The flea in the poor person's bed was a flea that the household's more limited resources had partially managed in the same way, but with less resources to deploy and less space to manage them in. The flea was present in both beds. The flea was present in every medieval bed, but the relative burden was different. The access to medical care was the class divide in medieval hygiene that had the most direct impact on the outcomes of the hygiene-related illnesses. The wealthy person who developed the dental abscess could afford the physician's consultation, the apothecary's preparations, and if necessary, the barber surgeon's intervention. The poor person who developed the same abscess was managing it with whatever the household's knowledge and resources could provide, and the specific gap between the physician's management of the dental abscess and the household's management of the dental abscess was the gap between the outcome where the infection was controlled and the outcome where it wasn't. The specific mortality from the hygiene-related illnesses, the waterborne diseases, the parasitic infestations, the secondary infections of the untreated wounds, followed the class gradient that the access to resources determined. The wealthy person who got the same waterborne illness as the poor person next door recovered with better food, better medical care, and better rest than the poor person could access. And the recovery rate difference was the mortality difference that the class gradient produced. This is not a medieval problem. The specific relationship between poverty and hygiene, the way in which the access to the resources of personal and public hygiene is distributed according to the same hierarchy that distributes every other resource, is a relationship that the modern world has not eliminated, only shifted in its specific expression. The modern wealthy person and the modern poor person have different hygiene outcomes because they have different access to the specific resources that the modern hygiene standard requires, and the mortality difference between the well-housed and the poorly housed, the well-fed and the hungry, the adequately medically cared for and the inadequately cared for is still a mortality difference that the modern public health literature documents. The medieval class divide in hygiene was a more dramatic version of a structural relationship that is not unique to the medieval period. The specific material conditions of the medieval world made the class divide in hygiene more visible, and its consequences more immediately lethal than the modern world's reduced version of the same structural inequality. But the structure, the relationship between the distribution of resources and the distribution of hygiene outcomes, is the same structure. The wealthy medieval person was cleaner than the poor medieval person. The wealthy modern person is cleaner than the poor modern person. The gap has narrowed dramatically and significantly because the modern public health infrastructure, the clean water supply, the sewage system, the public health medicine, has extended to the poor the basic hygiene resources that were previously available only to the wealthy. But the gap has not closed, and the specific hygiene-related mortality difference between the wealthy and the poor persists in the modern world in forms that are less dramatic, but not entirely different from the medieval original. The medieval wealthy person's cleanliness was the cleanliness of privilege. The medieval poor person's dirt was the dirt of deprivation. And the connection between the two, the specific structural resource-determined connection, is the connection that the history of hygiene documents from the medieval period to the present day, with the specific variations of material context, but the consistent structural relationship that the history of inequality has maintained. The Lord's bath was hot, private, aromatic, and frequent. The peasant's bath was occasional, public, or domestic, and performed with the specific resources that the working household had available after the working day was done. Both people were trying to be clean. One of them had considerably more help. Conclusion: you are cleaner than the medieval person. This is not a difficult conclusion to reach, given what the preceding chapters have covered. The shower you took this morning was genuinely cleaner than the weekly wooden tub bath of the medieval household. The toilet you used was genuinely better than the garderobe or the cesspit. The toothbrush and the fluoride toothpaste were genuinely superior to the hazel twig and the ground charcoal. The lice-free existence that the modern shampoo and the sealed house and the washed clothing provide is genuinely better than the fine comb and the occasional nitpicking session. The modern world's hygiene infrastructure, the sewage system, the clean water supply, the soap production, the washing machine, the antibiotic, has produced the specific extension of human health and human life expectancy that the historical record confirms as one of the most significant improvements in human well-being in the past 2 centuries. The reduction in infant mortality, the reduction in waterborne disease, the reduction in the parasitic disease burden. These are the specific, measurable benefits of the hygiene revolution that the germ theory and its infrastructure consequences produced. But the medieval person was not simply a dirty person who hadn't thought about cleanliness. They were a person operating in a specific material context with specific available resources, using those resources with the specific intelligence and the specific cultural framework that the medieval world provided. They washed, They groomed, they managed the smell of themselves and their environment with the specific technologies that the medieval world offered. They had ideas about cleanliness that were sophisticated within the theoretical framework available to them. And they pursued those ideas with the genuine effort of people for whom personal cleanliness was a real value rather than an optional extra. The cesspit was genuinely awful. The lice were genuinely universal. The dental situation was genuinely terrible. The waterborne illness that the contaminated water supply produced was genuinely deadly. These are not mitigated by the cultural context that produced them. The people who died of typhoid from the contaminated water were as dead as if they had died in any other context, and the suffering of the dental abscess was as real regardless of the theoretical framework within which it was treated. But the people who managed these specific challenges, who fine-combed the lice, and banked the fire, and heated the bathwater, and washed the hands before eating, and threw herbs in the rushes, and fumigated the sick room, were doing the best that the specific material world of the medieval period permitted. They were not passive victims of their hygiene situation. They were active, intelligent managers of it, within the limits of what the medieval world offered. The modern person who finds medieval hygiene disgusting is the modern person with the shower, and the toothbrush, and the sewage system, and the antibiotic, passing judgment on people who had none of those things. It is a judgment that is simultaneously correct. Medieval hygiene was, by modern standards, genuinely challenging and unfair. Medieval people were doing what they could with what they had, in the same way that the modern person is doing what they can with what they have. The difference is what they had, and what they had, while considerably less than we have today, was more than the popular narrative of the universally filthy medieval person has ever given them credit for. The hazel twig was not a toothbrush, but it was something, and the medieval person who used it was trying.